welcome Stewart Dick from Torabhaig Distillery, the global brand ambassador for the brand and for the distillery. Welcome to Vienna. Nice to have you here.
Likewise, thank you. Thank you for having me. Nice to be here in Vienna. This is my first visit to Austria. First visit to Vienna. It's been a busy couple of days, but it's been great and really lovely to meet you.
Since whiskey is not all about the liquid, it's about places and people. Let's talk about you first. Your connection to Torabhaig is in which way?
So I've worked for Torabhaig for a little over 2 years now. I joined as UK ambassador, and then earlier this year became global ambassador. So I've worked in whiskey for about 5 years. Prior to that, I describe my career as having spent 15 years figuring out what on earth I wanted to do. I had figured out quite early on that I wanted to do something that involved bringing knowledge to people, helping people learn about something. But then I needed to find the subject that I was passionate about. And so probably 6-7 years ago, I realized that subject was whiskey. So I started down a path with the goal of becoming a brand ambassador. And so a little over 2 years ago, that brought me to Torabhaig. And yeah, I love every day of the job. It's great.
And let's discuss Torabhaig in vivo with the liquids you brought with you. You brought 3 bottlings. Which one would you like to start with?
So yeah, I've got 3 bottles. So we're going to start with the Torabhaig Alt Glown. So this is the whiskey that we released a couple of years ago. This came out back in 2021. This was the second whiskey that we released from Torabhaig. It's part of our Legacy series. So the Legacy series is our journey to the release of a 10-year-old in 2028. And this whiskey follows on from our inaugural.
Thank
There you go.
Appreciate it.
So our inaugural release was fully matured in first fill bourbon. That was quite a small release. There was about 32,000 bottles for the world, so they sold out very quickly. 6 months or so later, Alt Glown followed, and this brought in a little bit of refill bourbon. So this uses very approximately 70 to 80% first fill bourbon, 20 to 30% refill bourbon. So what that does is it gives a really lovely illustration of distillery character, of house style, and of our spirit character.
Right. So how would you describe the house style?
So we set out with a vision that was created by our whiskey maker, Neil MacLeod Matheson. So Neil had this vision to create a whiskey which in the early days he described as elegantly rugged. So he knew he wanted a very clean spirit, a very delicate spirit. He also knew he wanted to create a peated whiskey, but a peated whiskey, as he describes it, the kind of peated whiskey that he would like to drink. So Neil is not a big fan of creosoles. He's much more of a guaiacol fan. So he didn't want a very medicinal whiskey. He wanted something that was more ashy bonfire smoke, gunflint, fireworks. And that's what he has created in Torabhaig.
Something that immediately comes to your nose when you nose them.
So there's a sort of a wafting of bonfire smoke. It's not in your face. It's a bonfire maybe 100 yards down the beach. There's a little bit of smoky bacon for me.
And some sweetness from the vanilla, from the casks.
And there's a lovely citrusy note in there as well. So it's a really nicely balanced whiskey. The flavours and the peatiness balances really, really well. And it's an interesting whiskey that when it comes to sampling at shows, because we get a lot of people who say, oh, I want something that's heavily peated, which this is. This is 77 phenol parts per million in the barley. So heavily peated barley. You hand somebody who is a big peat fan, you hand them this, they taste it and they go, oh, that doesn't smell heavily peated. And then we start to get nerdy. So we get very nerdy about our phenols. I know you visited the distillery, you spent time with Bruce, so you'll know how nerdy we get with our phenols. It was so slight aside, when I joined the company, my first day was spent on Teams calls with Bruce as my induction. And I think the most animated I got throughout that day was when he put up a slide that showed the development of the phenols from barley through to whiskey in the form of a set of bar charts and pie graphs. So I'm a nerd. I'm an unashamed nerd. So yeah, we get very, very nerdy about our phenols.
You should never drink whiskey before lunch, or not never, not too often. So slunge.
Slunge. The peatiness of it, it's delicate, it's clean. A word we find ourselves using a lot is approachable.
Yeah.
And that's particularly relevant for people who are new to peated whiskey.
Yeah.
Because it's one of those things that I think lots of people, when they get into whiskey, they want to find a way to love peat. But it can take a while. And very often they'll be introduced to peat through something very creosoly, very medicinal. And that often puts them off. But for anybody who does want to get to love peat, Torabhaig is a great way to do it.
If I would describe this as overall very gentle, very smooth, would you agree?
Yes, absolutely. I think really lovely and gentle. And the peatiness just builds slowly on the palate as you work your way through the dram. It's not an assault on the senses. It's that. I was going to say gentle caress of peat smoke, but I felt myself sounding very cliched saying that, but it is that.
Do you store all your casks close to the distillery? Do you have enough space for that?
No. In simple terms, we store some near the distillery. So we have a small warehouse. It has currently got, I believe, 1,002 casks. Graham, our site manager, is very specific about the number of casks that we have. So just that small warehouse. It would be wonderful if we could store all of our casks on Skye, and there's no question about that. But it's a question of land, first of all, and then it's a question of getting planning permission to build what are not the most attractive of buildings in terms of most warehouses. For us whiskey lovers, they are.
Yes.
But for people who are not whiskey lovers, they maybe aren't the most attractive of things. So we have one small warehouse. It is a very attractive warehouse.
Oh, it's close to the sea.
Yeah, it is. It couldn't be much closer to the sea.
No.
In fact, we had to build the ground up by about 6 feet. We used 1,002. Graham is again very specific. 1,002 tons of hardcore to build the ground up. So we built it up on top of what is essentially peat. So it's practically on the beach.
Okay.
It's an incredible place to taste whiskey. But most of our whiskey is stored in warehouses around Scotland. We rent space from other people. Our spirit is tankered away once a week. We don't fill casks on site.
Right.
So the casks that we have at Torabhaig were filled elsewhere and then brought back to the distillery.
I think you're very limited on what you can do on site because of the old building you cannot change.
Precisely,
so
yes.
That's why you have to tank it away, right?
Yes. So the building it's a listed building, so it's on a historic register of buildings. So that created some challenges when it came to build the distillery, but it was a challenge that we wanted to embrace because it really forms an important part of what we're doing at Torabhaig. So we wanted to build a legacy. That is really what we set out to do. So part of that was that we wanted to bring this building back to life. Now, we could have bought a plot, an empty plot of land. We could have put up a big metal shed. It would have been very fast. It would have been relatively cheap. But it wasn't what we wanted to do. We wanted to create this legacy in the form of the building as well. So the building is already 200 years old. It spent 200 years being a home for cattle. And so we hope that for the next 200 years, it will be the home to Torabhaig Distillery. So that is the future of that building.
I think we're both quite talkative people, but
yes.
We are constrained by time, so we have to move on to the second dram.
Certainly. So the second dram, now we're tasting these out of chronological release order. We're tasting them in the order that makes a little bit more sense flavour-wise. So the second dram is Torabhaig. Well, actually, I'm going to ask you to pronounce it. I'm going to see what your pronunciation is.
Knocknamoin.
That is right and wrong.
Yeah, as always with Gaelic.
Exactly. So, interestingly, I recently spent a week on Skye doing training sessions with bartenders, waiting staff, etc. I did about 6 training sessions over the course of the week. And in every single one of them, I had a Skinach. I had someone from Skye. And before I butchered the name, I asked them to try it. I got an assortment of different pronunciations. So, Knocknamonia, Crochnamonia, Knocknamoin, Crochnamoin. On Isla, they tend to say moin rather than monia. But it's some version of one of those. And as long as you're relatively close, people will forgive you. So this is Chapter 3. So we had Chapter 2 in the Legacy series. This is Chapter 3 in the Legacy series. And it's called Crochnamonia.
Crochnamonia.
That's the pronunciation that we are going for. It doesn't mean that it is the definitive pronunciation, but it's what we had to decide on, the one that we were going to go with. And this is our first foray into the use of sherry casks.
And it's very obvious that there is sherry casks.
Yes. You can see it very clearly in the difference in colour. So we've got quite a lot. It's a darker liquid. But we used the sherry casks sparingly. Neil wanted to bring in that little bit of sweetness and richness and depth and fruitiness. But house character is absolutely crucial to us. And that house character will be evident throughout the Legacy series. So one of the functions of the Legacy series essentially is so that when we release our 10-year-old, you will, broadly speaking, know what to expect. When a distillery that's been around for a couple of hundred years releases a new whiskey, you, broadly speaking, know what to expect. With Torabhaig, we're working towards that.
Just a word back on this one. I think it's pretty matured for how old it is.
Yes.
Yeah.
We hear that a lot. So both of these whiskies are, roughly speaking, between 4 and 5 years old. These are approximately the same sort of age. And we get a lot of people who are quite surprised at the relative youth of the whiskey. Now, Crochnamonia is built on Altglaun. It essentially uses Altglaun as a base. So Neil started with that 70-ish, 30-ish% first fill refill, and then he began adding sherry matured whiskey to it. So this uses some liquid that was fully matured in Oloroso casks and some liquid that was fully matured in Pedro Jimenez casks. So everything is full maturation, it's not a finish.
So the thing I notice right when I put it to my nose is that the peat is a little bit more covered than on the first expression. So peat doesn't jump into my nose now.
Yeah. So the interest, yes, I agree. And I think the sherry has ameliorated that a little bit. It has softened it. Interestingly, when we get very nerdy, the balance of cresols to guaiacols is very slightly different in this. There is slightly more cresols. But crucially, and this would be the case with Torabhaig in general, the cresols don't massively dominate the guaiacols.
So there's more fruitiness to the whiskey in the nose.
Fruity for me. There's a walnut note on the nose. It is evident that there's sherry there, but it's not a sherry bomb by any stretch of the imagination. It's a very deft use of sherry that Neil has produced. Slange. One thing which is always a very interesting comparison is these two side by side.
Yeah.
Because having used this as the base, it's unusual that you get to do that kind of comparison and see what flavors have been built with the addition of the sherry and what flavors have come from the sherry and what came from the bourbon cask. So that is again part of the purpose of the Legacy series is we want to share this evolution with people. We want people to see how the whiskey is developing, how it's changing, because we don't know. We don't know what a 10-year-old Torabhaig is going to taste like because nobody's ever done that before. Nobody's ever matured Torabhaig whiskey to 10 years old. So this is an opportunity for people to follow this journey and to engage with us on that journey and see how the whiskey changes, and as Neil starts experimenting with different cask types, because like most distilleries, the majority of our liquid is in bourbon casks. But we are also using Oloroso and Pedro Jimenez. We have Madeira casks. We have cognac casks. We have some Barbados rum casks. And we also have an assortment of virgin oak casks.
These are both full maturation in the cask.
Full maturation.
Are you not wanting to do finishes at all, or is that something that could happen or has happened?
I will always say never.
Yeah.
As far as I'm aware, the plan at the moment is to focus on full maturation. But plans change. The Legacy series has already evolved in and of itself. So originally there were 2 fewer bottles. We've added in another 2 chapters.
Yeah.
So it's going to be an annual release up until 2028. So never say never.
In my opinion, not using finishing but full maturation is the more honest way to produce whiskey.
And I think that's probably Neil's approach. Now, I haven't had that conversation with Neil, so I don't want to put words in Neil's mouth. But knowing Neil and knowing Neil's thoughts on whiskey making, I think that's probably his approach. I suspect there's probably also an element of that's the way he likes to make whiskey. I think there's maybe a bit more... I feel that there's maybe a little bit more opportunity to be very precise with flavour.
Well, there is another distillery on Skye. Would you say, if you compare their whiskies with yours, that there's something like a special Skye style of whiskey?
I think I don't know. I'm not sure that it is something that we can define as a Skye style in very basic terms, because I simply don't think there's enough of us. It's very easy for us to define an Islay style or a Speyside style because there's a sufficient number of distilleries. If we had to pin it down, I think it would be that flavour of brininess that we get, that very slight, it's a slight sour, tingly kind of influence. But I think it's more, we think of ourselves more as being of an island style rather than necessarily of a Skye style.
By the way, where do you get your peat from?
So our peat all comes from Aberdeenshire.
Okay.
So the peat is sourced by our maltsters, so we use Crisp for our maltings. So they source the peat from Aberdeenshire.
Okay. This one is very smooth and silky on the palate.
It's the richness from those sherry casks is really lovely. And I think, so this whiskey, in very rough terms, is approximately 90% the same whiskey as this. So there's a little less than 10% sherry matured.
But the difference is very distinct.
Yeah.
So you wouldn't say that's 90% of this.
No,
Never,
exactly.
Never.
It's you can, when you taste them side by side, you can absolutely see where this ends and this begins.
Yeah.
You can see that change. But the change in flavour from less than 10% sherry matured is quite astounding. And I think it's testament to the skill of the blender.
Yeah. Now there's a number that frightens me.
Yes, that is a big number.
At least at that time of the day, but nevertheless, we'll move on to the third one.
It's never too early to have a batch strength. So whiskey number 3 is Alt Glown batch strength. So this is the same recipe as the first one.
Okay.
But bottled unreduced at 61.1%. So
same liquid, not watered down. Same age, approximately.
Yes, approximately the same age. Approximately the same cask makeup.
Okay.
That 70-ish, 30-ish.
Thank you.
But bottled, but without any dilution. So, as you have just done, really interesting comparison. Once again, this is something that we don't often get to see. How many times have you heard a whiskey drinker say, "I'd love to know what this was like at cask strength"? We hear it all the time.
All the time, of course.
And because that's what the blender gets to experience. And so this is a very rare opportunity for people to get 2 bottles, compare them side by side and see how the liquid came before it was reduced. So everything we do is 46% or higher. Everything is natural colour, non-chill filtered.
I think it takes a little time in the glass to open up.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it is a little bit cool. So I think a little bit of warmth won't do it any harm at all.
Once again, it doesn't feel like a cask strength version of the first one. There's more to it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So in very simple terms, I describe it as Alt Glown dialed up to 11.
Yeah.
All of the balance is there, all of the flavours are there, but it's bigger.
Yeah.
But for a 61%er, it is incredibly delicate on the nose.
It is. Not stingy at all.
No.
Not at all. So you can even dive a nose in, which you normally don't with.
Yeah, you'd normally be holding back a little. But yeah, all of those flavors are there, and it's that rich, smoky, very, very slightly tarriness for me that is ever so Torabhaig.
So let's be brave.
Slange. It's so drinkable. Interestingly, so for about 6 months, these were the 2 whiskies that I had on tastings before this was released. And invariably, people would ask if I had mixed them up, because they often found this one to be gentler and lighter, and they thought, oh, you must have got them wrong.
It's very smooth as well. The alcohol is something you notice in the finish, but not on the palate. At least I do.
Yeah.
Beautiful. So if you would water that down to 46, it would be that one.
Yes.
With the appropriate marriage time, of course.
Yes. Yeah. Obviously, it's not an exact replica, but it's the equivalent. Bottled at a different time. So this actually was bottled as a send off for Oakland. So we have finished producing Oakland. We have quite a lot of bottles, so it will be with us for a little while. I can't be any more specific than a little while. That might be a year, that might be 2, it might be 3. It might last us until the 10-year-old. We don't know. But when we came to the end of bottling it, we released this. This was to send it off with a bang, with this batch strength. And I suppose in a way a little bit of a thank you to the drinkers and to let them see what it's like at that batch strength.
Stuart, such a pleasure having you with us here at Whiskey Experts. Thank you for the drams. Thank you for the explanations. Pleasure having you here.
It's been a pleasure chatting to you. Now, I do have one extra thing for us to have a little taste of.
That's great.
So this has just been released this week, so we'll give this a little taste.
Oh, sure.